As we begin our journey in today's opening session, we will start by mapping out the spectrum of ideas and political divides within the Jewish community regarding the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace. Where are the political divides, and what are the core differences between us? The goal is to provide a general articulation and deeper understanding of the nature of the disagreements that are alienating us from Israel and each other. And by charting this map, begin the process of setting forth a space for all of us to sit around the table.
Let's take a step back and try to look as objectively as we can at how the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace, and especially the pursuit of what is called the two-state solution, is talked about today across the Jewish world. Now, we should acknowledge, of course, that peace, as an idea and as a Jewish value, is about much more than reaching some agreement on an Israeli-Palestinian two-state outcome. Peace is, at least in part, about a fundamental shift in consciousness and human action. And in Jewish sources, it is as much, if not more, connected to interpersonal relations than international relations. But our goal here is not to explore all the potential meanings of peace, but to understand how the Jewish discourse on peace plays itself out today. If we want to change and deepen this discourse, we need first to have a much better grasp of where it actually stands. And that means understanding with much more sensitivity the different attitudes that are expressed in relation to the idea that peace can be achieved through a two-state framework. For the sake of this exercise, we need to take politics out of the equation just for a moment and observe how peace is spoken about in practice, as if we were all psychologists listening to the Jewish people lying on the couch in front of us. If we do that, I want to suggest that we can see a spectrum of views that in the end can be encapsulated into 5 core positions on the two-state outcome. Most, if not all of us, fall somewhere along this spectrum. Some of us have moved from one point to another on the spectrum over time, or advance a combination of these points. But I think this spectrum of 5 positions helpfully defines the range of the Jewish conversation on this issue. And it is worth taking some time to map out these 5 positions, telegraphically, without claiming, of course, to present them in any exhaustive detail. As I do this, I want you to think about where you position yourself on the spectrum, but also to begin to appreciate the different values, assumptions, and ideas that animate each position on this spectrum, and may motivate people to take a position different from your own. I want you to try not to be angered by other positions, not to immediately think of the counter-argument, but to take the time to really listen to the position and think what sentiments may lay behind it when that position is genuinely and thoughtfully expressed. Let's begin with the first of those 5, which I would describe as people for whom the idea of 2 states, of achieving a two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is a moral imperative for the Jewish people. The rhetoric, the language, the arguments that people in this camp use relate to the idea that the Jewish people should not be controlling another people. They speak in terms of Palestinian rights. They speak about the destructive role, in their view, of Israel's occupation. They make the claim that a people who have experienced the kind of persecution that the Jewish people have experienced throughout history should be champions of the rights to self-determination of others, not just their own. For advocates of this position, Palestinian statehood is not something we should avoid if we can and tolerate if we must. It is something for them that we as Jews are morally required to champion, even if we must at the same time seek to guarantee that that Palestinian state is a functioning and responsible neighbor to Israel. And so people who support this position couch an argument about peace in the language of what it is as Jews to be obligated to the rights of others. What is it that we need to do in order to ensure that we are acting morally in relation to the Palestinian people? They speak of a real urgency for big, immediate Israeli decisions to create a two-state outcome out of what they argue is our moral obligation. That's the first view, two states as a moral imperative. As we shift across the spectrum, there's a second view that you hear from some of the advocates of a two-state outcome, and that is the view of two states as a policy imperative, as something we need to do now to advance core Israeli policy objectives or national interests. People who speak in these terms tend less to use the language of moral obligation towards the Palestinians, but focus instead on how a two-state outcome is, in their view, necessary immediately in order to advance Israel's national interests. Advocates of this position tend to speak about the need to prevent Israel from being isolated in the world, of the need to deny oxygen to the forces of Israel's delegitimization. They speak about Israeli-Palestinian peace as critical to creating a cooperative environment with Sunni Arab states in the region, or enabling us to focus on greater challenges, whether internal to Israeli society or external, such as Iran. And they speak, perhaps most vocally, about a two-state outcome as necessary, as vital, in their view, to protecting Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. These kinds of policy arguments in favour of a two-state outcome are cast as being less about the Palestinians and their rights than they are about the welfare and security of Jews in a state of their own. But it is important to notice that this second position, even if couched more in policy terms, represents no less an adamant moral and values claim. The difference is that rather than focusing on the moral obligation to Palestinians, this position focuses on the moral imperative of self-preservation, the goal of advancing Israel's Jewish and democratic character, and of ensuring its enduring future as a place in which Jewish self-determination thrives and is engaged in the world. A third position on this spectrum is the idea of two states as an aspiration, as a worthy goal. Now, advocates of this position essentially say, yes, the goal of two states, of achieving self-determination for the Jewish and the Palestinian people, is the right moral objective. It's the right policy objective. But we just can't get there now. It's impossible, it's impractical, it's dangerous. And so for these people, while they don't abandon the idea, they say that for practical reasons, we don't have the option of making those big decisions now. And their focus becomes much more on what one might call managing the conflict, or keeping hope alive for a resolution sometime in the future. Advocates of this position focus on much more modest objectives: to protect Israel's shorter-term interests, to think of interim arrangements that protect the two-state aspiration, to cultivate coexistence as best we can, while at the same time explaining to the world and to ourselves that the option of actually achieving the two-state outcome is not currently available. This position too, which is quite widely held across the Jewish world, while it uses the language of what is practical, what is doable, has a clear potential moral underpinning. Doing only what is practical can be a moral conviction. True, it can sometimes be an excuse or reflect a kind of lack of higher aspiration. But it can also be driven by a strong belief that aspirations, as noble as they are, when implemented at the wrong time or pursued blindly without regard to what is realistically possible, can end up destroying many, many lives, and that being cautious and restrained is itself a moral requirement if what in the end matters is the welfare of the people you are trying to help. So these are three different ways in which advocates of a two-state outcome articulate their position, either as a moral imperative, or as a policy imperative, or as an aspiration, or perhaps sometimes as some combination of the three. If we continue along the spectrum, listening to the way the Jewish world talks today about peace, I think we hear two other positions that are in fact rejections of the two-state outcome. The first is the idea that a one-state outcome, not a two-state outcome, is a policy imperative. Now, the advocates of this position say essentially that it is impossible to establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza without that state becoming a mortal threat to the future survival and legitimacy of the Jewish state. There is no version in their assessment of a Palestinian state that is not a failed state or a terror state that would endanger Israel. And so rather than maintain the current situation, The only real option under this view is to try to imagine a situation where Israel controls the entire territory indefinitely. And while Palestinians, according to this view, may be given certain rights of collective autonomy, rights as individuals or as citizens in an expanded state of Israel, or perhaps rights to territorial self-determination elsewhere, the capacity for Palestinians to establish a separate sovereign Palestinian state of their own in this geographical area is ruled out. And this position is expressed through a core policy argument, which is simply that Palestinian self-determination in the form of a sovereign Palestinian state would risk the future of the Jewish state, that there is no current version of sovereignty for such a state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River that would not involve a fundamental danger and denial of the Jewish right to self-determination eventually. Here again, the argument is presented in policy terms, but it seems motivated by a core moral, even if controversial, claim that the right and duty of Jewish self-determination and Jewish self-preservation in these circumstances trumps all other values and considerations. If we continue along this spectrum, there's one final voice that I want to describe, and that is the voice that a one-state outcome is a moral imperative. Not just that it's a policy requirement because of an assumption that a Palestinian nation-state will never be able to live in true peace with a Jewish nation-state, but that there is actually a moral reason why there should be a one-state outcome as a matter of fundamental principle. Now, it is very interesting to note that the view that a one-state outcome is a moral imperative is actually expressed both as a right-wing and a left-wing position. As a right-wing position, the argument is made that what is moral and right to do in this circumstance is to ensure that respect is given to whoever has a more valid claim to the land. For right-wing Jewish advocates of this position, that claim can be based on a divine promise of the land to the Jewish people, on the holiness of the land, or on a historical and legal claim which argues that the Jewish people are the rightful sovereign in this land, by strength, for example, of the League of Nations mandate, which designated this territory as a Jewish national home. What is important to appreciate about this position for the moment is that what animates it is a stated view that what is just and moral is to respect the stronger claim and connection to the land, which for advocates of this position is the Jewish claim. The left-wing version of one state as a moral imperative can come in the form of a counter-argument to the right-wing claim I just made, namely that it is the Palestinian claim to the land, not the Jewish claim, that is actually the stronger claim, and it is the one that needs to be validated. But this argument also comes in a different form, and that is to argue that a two-state outcome would essentially never be able to provide genuine equality both to Jews and Palestinians. The argument goes that it would necessarily undermine the rights of Palestinians, including refugees, to live throughout this land, and it would undermine the rights of Jews to live throughout this land. Advocates of this position often use the moral language of equality and argue in particular that the Palestinian state that would emerge as part of any two-state deal would necessarily be truncated. It would necessarily be less dignified and less equal than the Jewish state, in part because of the difference in power and security calculations between the two sides. And so for those who advance this view, the stated moral requirement here is less about guaranteeing collective self-determination in separate nation states than it is in the hope for a situation in which individual Jews and Palestinians can each live equally in this space, which requires, in their view, some kind of binational state or a neutral state. Now, all these five positions, two states as a moral imperative, two states as a policy imperative, two states as an aspiration, one state as a policy imperative, and one state as a moral imperative. All these positions exist within the Jewish world. And depending where you go, you hear different versions of them. And depending where you go, in most communities, some versions are considered absolutely unacceptable, and some versions are considered the mainstream or at least tolerable. And here it is important to be clear. I am not suggesting that every time these different positions are expressed, they reflect some deep and legitimate moral convictions by the people expressing them. Sometimes these positions are staked out thoughtlessly, in ways that are morally problematic or controversial, or even morally blind. Sometimes they are expressed in ways that show no real attempt to struggle with the reality on the ground, or for that matter, the reality of what may or may not be acceptable or even possible on the Palestinian side. And sometimes these positions are expressed without any regard for their broader moral implications and the potential injustices that could result if these positions were adopted wholesale. The goal here is not to legitimize each of these positions, however and by whomever expressed. It is to challenge ourselves to see, as observers and participants of the Jewish discourse on peace, what possible moral values could drive the different positions along this spectrum, and to ask ourselves seriously what possible place these values have in how we formulate our own positions and in the way we talk and listen to one another. To ask, for example, what weight and consideration should be given to values such as equality or the justness of a legal claim, even if our own position gives priority to some other value and leads us to some other conclusion. What claim should the values and moral convictions that could motivate other positions have upon us, even if we don't embrace them completely? And how do we take them seriously into account? As we go forward in this series, we're going to drill down and try to have a deeper understanding of the role of these values, the role that these values play in our tradition and our sources. We are going to see, hopefully, that even if we as Jews come out in different places along this spectrum, the values which, at their best, can drive other positions along this spectrum are values which we can connect with, which we can respect, and which we need to consider. So, for example, the idea that two states is a moral imperative because the Jewish people have, as a result of their tradition and experience, an obligation to the rights of others, is an idea, a value, that we can connect to as Jews even if we come out in a different place as to what weight to give this value in the circumstances. To take another example, two states as a policy imperative, two states as an aspiration, and one state as a policy imperative all give significant weight to the value of self-preservation. They differ less about the significance of the value of self-preservation than about the application of that value to the facts. They may be influenced by different security experts, but at some level, they are not morally foreign from one another. Their practical conclusions are different, but their moral motivations are not. If that is true, if whether you support one outcome or another turns in practice on whether your factual assessment of the situation leads you to the conclusion that a Palestinian state is either a threat to peace or a critical ingredient for peace, then at least you need not see the person expressing a position different to yours as morally bankrupt, if that position is expressed by them seriously and thoughtfully. They may be analysing the facts differently, but they could be worthy of your moral respect, not your moral contempt. For too long now, the Jewish people seem to have been arguing about peace instead of actually talking about it. Too many of these conversations happen in echo chambers. We enter these conversations with our facts and our politics, and we leave them with our facts and our politics, without having really listened to one another. When there are these intense debates on Israeli-Palestinian peace, on campus or in communities around the Jewish world, I have this feeling that people leave these sessions quietly saying to themselves, you know, I was really impressed with the point of view of that person that I already agreed with. And then saying, you know, I really didn't like the point of view of that person that I already didn't agree with. We listen only for what we want to hear, for that which reaffirms what we already think. In some ways, the intensity and passion with which these debates happen is puzzling. We engage in argument with each other as if that very conversation were going to decide how to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But we know, of course, that a talk at your local synagogue or JCC or Shabbat table may not be the place where the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be decided. The truth is that the way we have these arguments about peace across Jewish communities may not determine the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they may well determine the future of our communities. For too many communities, really talking about peace, as opposed to just arguing about it, is almost impossible. Paradoxically, it is the issue of peace itself and the argument around it, perhaps more than any other, that can be the most polarizing and acrimonious. For some rabbis and communal leaders, the issue has become so toxic, so volatile, that they decide it's better not to touch it. If we want to claim peace as a core Jewish value, if we want to stop it from being something that ruptures communities and alienates many Jews both from Israel and from one another, if we want to be a people that champions deep, respectful, meaningful dialogue, then we need to figure out how we engage this issue of peace, not just as a shallow political conversation, but as a deeper values conversation. A kind of conversation that is not just about exchanging facts and arguments on a policy level, but also excavating the moral principles behind those positions and thinking how we should calibrate them. We need to take seriously the values that shape our position. We need thoughtful answers as to why we prioritize some values over others. And we need to insist that others cast their position in ways that take values seriously as well. We need a conversation that is neither blind to the complexities and excruciating dilemmas associated with the pursuit of peace in the real world, but not blind either to the importance our tradition and ideas place on the goal of coexistence and peace as quintessential Jewish values and as an animating principle for the Jewish people. It is important to understand that we do not need to do all this in order to reach some grand agreement on how to achieve peace. I'm not even sure consensus is a goal we should aspire to as a people, even if it were possible. Our tradition and value perspectives are too diverse and rich to be exhausted by one opinion, and the reality is just too complex for there to be one answer. We need to reimagine the conversation about peace, first because our health and unity as a people depends in large part on our ability to really talk to each other, to see the merit and the humanity and the values in one another. And second, because if our positions on the challenges facing peace for Israel are not grounded in a serious values conversation, they cease to be compelling, and they risk becoming disconnected from who we want to be as a people of moral excellence. And they risk disconnecting us from Israel in the process. Some may think that the way we argue about peace is basically inevitable, that we don't have an option but to shout at each other, to delegitimize each other. The stakes are too high, the emotions are too raw. But this series, and the iEngage project as a whole, is committed to the idea that we are better than that. That an ancient people with the experience, responsibility, and traditions that we have are capable of imagining a different kind of conversation with one another, even on the most difficult issues. You know, we often think that change is impossible before it happens, and then think it's inevitable after it happens. It's going to be in our hands to make that change. And maybe the first step is to begin to connect to and take seriously not just the facts and positions that suit us, but the values that we hold dear and that others hold dear. If we can do that, we can begin to learn how to talk about peace and not just argue about it. We can help reclaim peace as a real and relevant Jewish value. And no less importantly, we can advance the solidarity of the Jewish people and the health and vibrancy of Jewish life. Thank you.